for the World Cup. Go and compete.
Hello and welcome to This Week Back in the Day, a brand new series from the Green Machine podcast. And what a better way to kick it off than to talk about how Jack Charlton got the Ireland gig on the 7th of February 1986. But also, we're here to talk about how he almost didn't. And we're also here to talk about just how close we were from not having a Jackie's Army and not having put him under pressure. Turn it off. As always, I'm David, your host, and this week I'm joined by our own honorary Irishman, Mr. Martin Prendergast. How are you doing, Martin?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Dave. Looking forward to covering this one. I think it's an exciting time, and this was brilliant. This was, how it turned out, and it's a really interesting story to see about how he was actually appointed.
This is a fascinating topic. I don't think people understand, and something that we really want to do here on This Week Back in the Day, where we get stories from yesteryear. And we basically shine a light on them, really, isn't it? We just want to put new light to a newer audience and just kind of show you how mad things were. I mean, they're still mad now, but how really crazy things were back in the 80s with the FAI, and just some of the practices were really mad. I mean, and the way this one went down, it's incredible. I cannot wait to get stuck into this. So, in order to talk about how one reign starts, we need to have a little chat about how another one ends, and that was Owen Hand's reign. Owen Hand had decided to retire after a 0-0 draw with Norway back in May, and that sort of left the FAI with plenty of time for a rethink. Irish football had been in the doldrums for pretty much ever, and not helped by the fact that just up the road, an hour up the road in Northern Ireland, a little fella called Billy Bingham was doing ever so well with a much smaller pool and probably not as good a pool of players that the Republic had. So they thought, we need a bit of a rethink. Owen's last game in charge was a humiliating 4-1 defeat at home at the hands of the Danish, which seems to be a recurring theme. And even after that game, the RT2 continuity announcer decided to add to the levity by announcing, and after the break, we will have more comedy with cheers. Amazing. Bit sad, really, wasn't it? Just to talk a little bit about Owen Hand, a great servant to Irish football, Martin. Great players. Very unlucky, wasn't he, with the World Cup 82 qualifiers? And, it just never got going for him after that, did it?
No, that really left a big kind of a big damage to him, really. I think professionally, I think he started to feel the pressure of the job a lot more after being robbed in 82's qualifying campaign. And I think also he just felt the pressure of the crowd, and he felt the pressure of the press, and it was all getting on top of him. And we had an incredible pool of players and talented players available then. We have to remember that, and we still couldn't get across the line to qualify for a tournament. He will be kind of considered as quite an unlucky manager, but sadly, it just was coming to an end, and this was the whole thing again. Like you said, it was a humiliating defeat against the Danish in Dublin, and it came to an end. They were in a high going off to the World Cup in 1986.
That was a fabulous Denmark team as well, wasn't it?
It really was as well, yeah. It definitely was. Well worth looking up and see how some of these really well-known players now who were playing for them. And they were off to World Cup, and we were really stuck in the doldrums still.
Yeah, world-class team, but just not going anywhere. I think there was like 14,000 fans or something in Lansing Road. If you ever see the footage of it, like literally just nobody at it. You can even see Owen Hand, and he's got his hands on his hips, and he's just sort of looking around thinking, well, this is my last game. I haven't left this in better shape than I found it. Did you know, actually, in Dalymount Park, I think they had a draw with Mexico, and 6,000 fans showed up. I think that was in 1984, and it was the lowest attendance ever for an Ireland match.
It was always difficult for Ireland at that stage as well. We have to remember, like we're talking 20, 30 years ago, and that, we didn't have floodlights at a lot of our stadiums then. So a lot of the games even used to be in the afternoon, and it was probably difficult for the lads to kind of motivate themselves a little bit. But we had an incredible pool of talent, as you said. And yeah, it just people were disillusioned with the football on the pitch. A lot of the players weren't making themselves available, incredibly talented, as we said, and plying their trade with some of the top teams in England at the time, but weren't really that willing to come over. And if you look back at the history of the FAI, even back a couple of decades before as well, even in times of John Giles and things, a lot of players, we think of them as legends today and stuff, but they weren't actually turning out for Ireland very regularly. And that was always a challenge then for the manager coming in to try and get people to want to play and represent their country.
We will cover Owen Hand's reign in future episodes. Don't worry about it. But we're going to focus on the man himself. But yeah, there's so much to talk about. We've got years of content, really. So the FAI, as we said, looked across the border at how Billy Bingham was doing. He was actually based in Stockport at the time, and he had some great success with the Northern Irish team. He qualified for the '82 World Cup, beat Spain 1-0. You never guess who scored the goal, Martin?
Armstrong.
Yeah, because he never mentions it, does he? Never brings it up. And obviously was actually going to our World Cup in Mexico '86 as well, which is mad, as we said, considering the size of the talent pool and the size of the country compared to the Republic. But anyway, so a rethink was needed. And that brought up a list. So before this, Irish managers were always, and it seems a bit mad now, but always were based in Ireland. Johnny Giles was manager, as Martin alluded to earlier. However, he had moved back. I think he was Shamrock Rovers and Ireland manager at the same time. And basically, yeah, we never had a foreign, so-called foreign manager, which is obviously has changed over the last few years. So this is all a bit new for the FAI. So we're going to have a look at the initial list by the FAI. Well, what was reported at the time anyway, in 1985 and 86. So Billy McNeill, who was the Man City manager at the time, a Lisbon line, a Celtic legend, he was top of the list. Liam Toohey, former Ireland manager, and was actually the current youth manager at the time. No under 21s back then, Martin. It was just the youth manager. Jack Charlton, he'd actually quit Newcastle the year before he'd walked out. In fact, in 1985, he wasn't too happy, didn't want to spend the money, and wasn't really. He's the hometown lad, but the fans didn't quite appreciate him, so he skedaddled. Jim McLaughlin was the Derry City manager. He was on the short list there. Noel Cantwell, Man United, an Irish legend. That would have been interesting, Martin. Noel Cantwell?
Yeah, he would have been interesting. Also at West Ham, wasn't he? Yeah, fantastic player and yeah, interesting one, definitely.
FA Cup winning captain of Man United. Paddy Mulligan, former Shelbourne manager. He'd actually applied for the post before, but he lost out to Owen Hand by a single vote. And apparently one FAI committee member said that he had voted against Mulligan because he thought Mulligan had thrown a bun at him on a passed away trip.
Such is the life of the FAI. I mean, it's just amazing. I'd recommend anyone to go back and look at the history of the FAI, and some of the goings on is Father Ted stuff, to be honest.
May I just say, for any of our younger listeners, please bear with us because we're going to get into all this. That's the sort of pettiness that the FAI was built on, and that is the sort of stuff that we're going to uncover and we're going to bring to you. Lost out on a job because I thought you threw a bun at me, a sticky bun at my head. Amazing. Probably, I bet you that away trip is in Bygosh. Probably trying to get him on. No, we won't. So mad. There's a few stories from those past away trips. Probably best not say them on here. We don't want any legal action. But yeah, we'll definitely get to those. Another name, actually, which I have recently shared on Lansdowne Road, Martin. I love my research. I love the rabbit holes you are going straight down, finding out these different things. And what I was a bit shocked with a couple of years ago, brought it to the attention of everybody, was that Brian Clough was approached and was interested in December 1985 with the Ireland job. Now, Nottingham Forest had kind of ruled that out. They said, no, there's no way, because, it's Peter Taylor had left at that stage, his right-hand man. They had a massive fallout for the second time. So it was just him running that club. And they thought it was too much for him running Ireland, or ERA, as they like to say back in the 80s and 70s, and Nottingham Forest at the same time. So they said no to that. But Clough is quoted as saying that he was very interested in it and that Bobby Robson would crawl on his knees to bring the sort of talent that the Irish possessed. We touched on it there. Liam Brady, Mark Lawrenson, Ronnie Whelan, Frank Stapleton, all these guys in their peak, Paul McGrath, tip-top players, world-class, David O'Leary. Yeah, not to underestimate how talented this team was. Out of that group, the one man, funnily enough, that the FAI, and I was a bit shocked at this, Martin, actually, that they offered him the job pretty much unofficially. I believe so, from what I've read in the Irish Times. is Billy McNeil, the first guy that we mentioned, the Lisbon Lion, the Man City manager. He was pretty much offered that job on the 7th of January, 1986. I didn't actually know about that.
No, neither did I, David. And like you said there, the thing we have to consider with this, why it was attractive to Brian Clough and some of these managers, was the international role was still perceived as a part-time job. You could actually combine it with your club role. And I think that just shows you where we were in football in those days. That, you think back to Brian Clough and what he was doing at Nottingham Forest and what he had achieved already. And yet he was considering in his career, after winning European Cups, that he would like to try international football without having to give up Nottingham Forest. So that was why it was attractive. Man City manager Billy McNeil was, as we've said, basically offered the job, but it was going to be a dual role. And I think the FAI even went over to City to try and negotiate basically the money that they were going to, compensate Man City for the period. I think it was 30 or 40 days where he would be not focusing on Man City business, but would be serving Ireland.
And people would probably say, oh, FAI, but that was just the way football was. This is still old football. International management was a part-time role, absolutely, and they weren't millionaires at the time either. So a week later, that was ruled out by the club, and chairman Peter Swales, good old Peter Swales, Man City, they just said no. They didn't think that Billy McNeil could do both roles. Funnily enough, actually, McNeil would quit City in September of 1986, and he'd take over Aston Villa, but would finish last in Division 1 in 1987. So that leaves us with just 3 serious contenders from the original list. Liam Toohey, who, yes, Irish legend, former Ireland manager. He was actually okay, Martin, with the FAI going with an English-based manager, but he did say to them that, you know what, if you can't get the type of English-based manager, I understand why you're doing it. I'm here for you, just in case you can't get the right guy. What a company man he was. And I actually don't say that I genuinely don't say that with any sarcasm. Like, just what a guy, Liam Toohey.
Yeah, Liam Toohey was a bit of a legend, wasn't he? I mean, he had a good record with the youth, as you said, and responsible for bringing a lot of them lads through. And he was really a company man, incredibly loyal to the FAI. He managed Ireland in the past when he was actually doing 2 other jobs at the same time. So that's how crazy this is. He was actually giving so much of his time and being an Irish manager and doing I think he was a sales rep for ice cream. And incredible, and that was our Ireland manager then. So, and yet, sadly, often we were found to be the whipping boys.
Whipped cream.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Sorry, that's a terrible joke.
Yeah, we can go.
Yeah. And of course, that left Jack and Johnny Giles. Now, Johnny Giles, they wanted him back in. Now, Giles, it's kind of funny, though. We actually talked about this earlier on. Now, Giles is a very polar. Now, nowadays, he's not. He's a legend, and rightfully so. But back in the day, people might not realize this, but Johnny Giles was a very polarizing figure in Irish football, in Ireland in general. He was a great Leeds player, but he did anger fans of other clubs because not only was he a technically brilliant player, wonderful passing, genuine world-class player, he was a dirty bastard. Yeah. Quite frankly. And when we say dirty, Martin, we're not talking handbags. We're talking like knocking out Kevin Keegan in the Charity Shield. Well, hitting him at least. Proper digs. But he also had come over. He was West Brom manager, and he'd left because he was actually very good as West Brom manager too, but he kind of got fed up of the politics of English football. Came back home to Dublin with Eamon Dunphy to buy a share in Shamrock Rovers with his brother-in-law, Louis Kilcoyne. And the whole idea was to bring Shamrock Rovers and make them a European powerhouse. And that just upset pretty much everybody that wasn't affiliated with Shamrock Rovers at the time. And then eventually upset Shamrock Rovers fans. And then basically he was Ireland manager. And people weren't very endeavoured with his style of football, were they, Martin, for Ireland? Like they found it very boring and very tippy-tappy and just not adventurous, really.
Yeah, which is a total odds to some of the highlights you see of John Giles. He's one of the first players I've seen ever in the highlights now to do a Rabona and incredibly talented player. You have to remember he was a former kind of Busby babe in some respects. He was released by Matt Busby at Man United, which Busby said himself was a massive mistake because he went over to Leeds and he was part of that kind of renaissance of Leeds Football Club, where under Revie. Revie had them playing a certain style of football. They were tough men. He was working as well then with like Billy Bremner, Jack Charlton, people who didn't mess around. They looked after themselves on the pitch. They were really, that's why they're called Dirty Leeds. They were, and we're not going to enamor ourselves to many Leeds fans on this, but incredible side, and they come close to winning European Cups and everything. And they won the league title, and that's obviously well documented in that film with Brian Clough and stuff. But he was very dirty, Giles. And you have to remember as well, looking back at the history, we do consider him a legend now, and rightly so. But, he didn't play for Ireland for a number of years as well, after falling out with managers and the kind of FAI council who picked the squad. He probably was a pro ahead of his time in a sense, and was very much determined to get fair pay for players, same as Dunphy. And that's why they became cohorts, as we obviously saw later on in their punditry.
And of course, Johnny Giles was credited. He was the manager before Owen Hand, not beforehand. And he was one that was really credited with bringing the standard of the Irish team up, that bit of professionalism in there, because obviously, he played with the best players, as Martin had said earlier on. And, he was actually very well regarded at West Brom. So now we get to the selection process, where 18 members plus the president would gather together in a smoky room in 80 Merrion Square on the 7th of February, 1986. 80 Merrion Square, of course, being the old Georgian headquarters of the FAI. And they would have a list of Charlton, Giles and Toohey. However, there was a little trick up the sleeve of a certain member of the FAI, believed to be Mr. Des Casey, the late, great Des Casey, who actually was one of the good guys, to be fair. Speaking of a man ahead of his time, it was believed that he had Bob Paisley, the legendary Liverpool manager, up his sleeve and basically willing to take the job. He'd been approached beforehand around the time when Brian Clough was approached, and he sort of turned it down. Yes, we could have had Bob Paisley. Now, Martin, since you're a Man United fan, I will get you to explain to our listeners how great Bob Paisley was as Liverpool manager. We are talking one of the greatest managers of all time.
Yeah, certainly at that period in football, he was well regarded, and Liverpool had an amazing team.
Three European Cups.
3 European Cups. That was just for our younger listeners as well. We must remember that the European Cup at that stage, it was just, it was the champions of the country would be participating in it.
So it was a lot harder to win.
It was probably easier to win because you'd come
up against
a lot of minnows and, from small nations. It was the luck of the draw as well, who you'd get. I think actually Liverpool, if you look back at their history of European Cups, I think they won one tie on the flip of a coin after a draw. But that I digress. And the bitterness about Liverpool's coming out in me. But no, look, he had a fantastic reputation. Was 65. We have looked, and we've in our history again, we've looked at people and we've ruled out them for being a bit of an older generation, even though they've got great experience. And we must stress as well, with the Irish job, it technically was and basically was operated as a part-time job. So it could have been very attractive to a gentleman of that age with that experience. And as well, we have to remember what an attractive job it was to look at because of the player pool we had. We had the likes of Liam Brady. We had like Paul McGrath coming through. Jack Stapleton was there as well. We had a really good young side coming through then.
Not to get sidetracked for too long, actually, on that, but I have to give credit to the FAI here. I mean, two of the managers they went after, Brian Clough and Bob Paisley, two of the best in the business at that time. You have to give credit there. I mean, they are players. Sorry, they are managers fitting for players of that quality, really, aren't they? World-class managers and world-class players.
Without a doubt. And that's why it was very attractive to them, though, as well, because they could recognise the players and knew them from the league, because Irish players were playing week in, week out in the Division 1 at the time, and were playing in Europe and a very, very good level, and were in championship-winning teams. So it was very, very attractive to look at them players and think, hang on a second, there's something wrong here somewhere, that team isn't being able to qualify for tournaments, because that was the state we were in at the time. You also have to remember the FAI were absolutely skint. We were on our arse at the time, which we've had since and before. And that's the situation as well. It wasn't going to be paying a lot of money, but I think it was a prestigious job because, again, looking at the players and thinking, actually, for my own ego, I'm going to be the one who creates history with this country, and I'll qualify them for a World Cup or a European Championship.
So Bob Paisley actually made the 3-man shortlist, a 4-man shortlist. And that wasn't supposed to be the case. And that actually did cause massive uproar amongst the FAI board at the time, the 19-man FAI board. So people weren't very happy about this. And this is where a bit of pettiness comes into it. Kind of works in our favor a little bit when we see where the story goes. However, we're going to talk now, Martin, how Jack got the job, how the FAI functioned, to put the term loosely, at that time in 1986. Now, today, if you want to hire a manager, I imagine the CEO would say, this is who I want. And basically, he'd recommend it to the board, and the board had to ratify it or something to that degree. Or back in the John Delaney days, he just basically said, yeah, I want this guy. And yeah, well, yeah, that's a great idea, John. Allegedly. But in 1986, they all had to vote on it. And whoever got the job had to get a minimum of 10 votes. Right? So you had to get 10 votes. So stick with me here, folks. This took me a while to get my head around it, but I'm going to try and explain it in the clearest, most concise possible way. Are you ready, Martin?
Yep.
Right, here we go. So as I said, 10 votes or more were required for a win, and there's 19 members on the panel, including the president, Des Casey. However, his vote could only come into play if 2 candidates were tied, and he would get the deciding vote. That was the power of the president. No CEO back in those days. So the results of the first round are Toohey with 3 votes, Giles with 3 votes, Charlton with 3 votes, and Bob Paisley with 9 votes. Just let that sink in, Martin. Obviously, it's deadlocked, but Bob Paisley was 1 vote away from being the Republic of Ireland manager. 1 vote.
And thus changing history forever for the association. Because obviously, we know that, spoiler alert, Jack gets the job. But very interesting. I mean, with this voting process, it just shows you the kind of circus-like operation within the FAI. At that time, there was a lot of factions between the board of the FAI, and that's why the voting's so key here, because Paisley, a lot of people were disgruntled that he came in the back door. Toohey was a company man and was well respected. Giles had been kind of promised that he would get the support from a number of the board, and really he only put himself forward and was persuaded to come back in because basically, for a little bit for his own ego, he didn't want to put himself up originally, and so too did Paisley. If they weren't going to get the job, they didn't really want to advertise that they were the ones who were actually going to be considered for the job if they weren't actually going to get it. So a little bit of ego in there, even back then in 1986. So yeah. Very, very interesting to focus on that as well. But Paisley, I mean, it could have changed history completely. 1 vote away, but then we know what happened.
Yeah, I mean, Giles actually, did you looking at my history notes, Giles was actually favourite to get the job in January. He apparently was very close to getting it. Or, well, he was believed. He believed he was very close to getting it. So after the second vote, Liam Toohey would find himself eliminated. And with the third vote, Johnny Giles would find himself eliminated too. On the third count, Paisley got 9, still just 1 away. Charlton with 5 and Giles with 4. Des Casey still not able to use his vote. As we said earlier, 2 candidates have to be tied. And it just wasn't happening. But wasn't all bad for Des Casey, because that would just leave Charlton and Paisley, and basically Paisley be leading the whole way. So surely it's just academic at this stage. Well, actually, it wasn't. Charlton would end up winning the vote 10-8. What happened? Well, basically, somebody on the board who wasn't very happy with Bob Paisley's late inclusion decided to stick the knife in Des Casey and just say, no. And that was it. Charlton got the job. How crazy is that, Martin?
It is crazy. I mean, the voting procedure alone is quite complicated, as we know. And it was kind of strange. Obviously, someone had turned away completely. I mean, Casey, before the final vote, he must have been thinking, look, my man's home and hosed here, because even if everyone's votes who's gone to Charlton, Giles and Toohey, if it was 9 each, he would have had a decided vote. The fact someone jumped ship and went for Charlton then just shows like the absolute kind of shit show that was going on in the background with the FAI at the time. And as we said, there was factions there and people. I know it's been really well covered, this in a sense, in Paul Rowan's The Team That Jack Built, but it's just a shit show, and
Brilliant
it's just
book.
mad to actually think about it.
Yeah, that's a brilliant book, by the way. Team That Jack Built, fantastic. Paul Rowan, great book. So, Charlton has a job. Great. Let's tell him. Oh, wait, we can't. Why? Because the FAI actually didn't have a phone number to ring him and tell him he got the job. You couldn't make this up. The FAI did hold a press conference just to announce that Jack had got the job, although they weren't too sure whether he would accept it or not, because, as we said, they didn't have a phone number to ring him. How Jack found out, Martin, was that apparently he was at a hunting lodge in Cloverdale in Yorkshire, and his teammate, I believe, in England, Jimmy Arfield, who was actually a journalist at that stage, had tracked him down and told him he got the job. And he also gave the FAI Jack's number. Obviously, now we have the internet, we have social media, things get leaked and all that kind of stuff. You know, it's quite porous these days. But back in 1986, the 7th of February 1986, Martin, the Irish public found out about the new Ireland manager on, well, basically the Twitter of Ireland back in the 80s, and that was a Late Late Show. And have a listen to this. This is a clip of Gay Byrne announcing he's handed a piece of paper, and he announces to the Irish public, and let's be honest, most of them would have been watching at that time.
Did you notice we haven't had a soccer manager for the Republic of Irish team in 3 months? Haven't lost a match in that time either. Very extraordinary. Well, I've just been told that Jack Charlton has been appointed manager of the Republic football team. Jackie Charlton. You're interested in that there? You were expecting that, were you? There you are, you see.
That's amazing, isn't it? When you think of 2 years later, like Euro 88.
Exactly, yeah. Gay was like leading the sing-song with the Irish team. With the Ole Oleas and everything like that, and the Ireland. I mean, look, that's just what it was about then. The Irish football wasn't massively popular then. You know, it was the arrival of Jack Charlton that was going to be our springboard to actually qualify for a tournament. And you look at how that was received in the audience there. You know, maybe there weren't any freebies being given away that night. But fair play. I'd love to meet the lone clapper, the lone whooper.
How that was received by the public was pretty much how it was received by the press. Although Jack did have one supporter in the media, funnily enough. I found this quote from this particular person, Martin. I'm going to read it out to you here. Leadership has been restored to Irish football at international level. Decent skinmanship has finally been dispensed with. Do you know who wrote that?
I'll tell you who wrote it, David. Eamon Dunphy.
Yes, he did. That's amazing, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Interesting that Eamon Dunphy is the one to support him, because with the close links with Giles as well. And I think Giles was probably a little bit disappointed that he didn't get the job. Ultimately, I think he had actually prepared that how it was going to be announced. He was going to be interviewed that evening. I think from around the corner, he was holed up at a hotel, I think in Dublin, actually, at the night of the vote, basically. So he must have been quite confident. But yeah, very interesting. I think that Eamon Dunphy was a supporter of Jack, and I think again this is probably a legacy kind of thing from Dunphy when he was involved with Ireland and actually coming away from the role as a footballer. You know, he wrote Only a Game as well, where it's a fantastic book to read about how he's dealing with the kind of trials and tribulations of a player coming to the end of their career. He was forging his career and his name in the media at this stage as well. So it's interesting to see how he had adapted to his life there. But the fact that some of the things he was asking for change within the FAI as an organisation, he was actually confident that Jack Charlton was the one who's going to be bringing this to the table.
But whatever the critics may say about his managerial qualifications, Jack Charlton is certainly well able to defend himself. Today he dismissed George Best, who had voiced loud dissent at the appointment, as someone with no credibility whatsoever. Other criticism he simply ignored, saying his priority now was to get on with the job. And that job begins in earnest tomorrow morning, when he meets his new employers to discuss his terms of reference. He's clearly disillusioned with British club soccer, but why the move to manage the Irish team?
Why the Irish team? The Irish team, it's the national coach's job. It was the one I've always, for the last 3 or 4 years, looked at, strangely enough. Don't know why. I think it's because we look at it from abroad, from the English side of the border, and we look at the results and we think, well, friends, there's some good players over there. And it's a job of great possibility.
Dublin Airport looking exactly the same. The arrivals, it really hasn't changed. It's still fucking dingy. Yeah, I mean, Jack's just confirming what we've all been saying. Like, it's a perfect job, isn't it? Quality players across the road. On to the next day, where Jack would face the press proper.
Particularly when
The
we've been
Republic's
based
controversial
in the
new
UK.
soccer supremo was giving very little away at a sometimes
You know, if you
stormy
want hold
news
of me, at least
conference
I
in
know
the
where to get
Westbury
hold of you.
Hotel this evening. But he
I've-
will be
I've
signing
never
a
signed a
3-year
player in my
contract
life
for
without-
an undisclosed fee. He remained tight-lipped on the question of who his assistant manager might be. I asked him what he planned to do about the abysmal standard of Irish international soccer.
Bring the expertise to it. I've been brought up in the game all my life. I know it inside out. I've worked with some very, very knowledgeable and good people at that level. I've seen quite a lot of it, and generally, even though I can't alter the individual ability of players, I can probably alter the structure in the way they think.
You'll be giving some thought to the problem of dealing with players who are stars in their own right for their own clubs. That's a great disappointment. Absolutely.
I'll only find out when I've seen them play. I mean, how they perform for someone else, how they perform for me, it's totally different. I might ask different things of them. I might accept things from them that you would think is wrong.
Now, what you don't see is Peter Byrne asking Des Casey about the Bob Paisley part of the process. So obviously, you know, Peter is getting his inside information, I'd imagine, from one of the failed candidates, and kind of knows he knows what's going on back in the day. But he asked him about Bob Paisley, and Charlton, of course, wades in to help out. I think Des must have been a little bit flustered about it and said to, go, Casey doesn't have to answer that question. Mr. President doesn't. And Dunphy, Eamon Dunphy, chipped in and said, well, actually, that's in the public interest. So you do need to answer that question. And Charlton immediately recognized Dunphy. And he says, I know you. You're a troublemaker, you. And basically, Martin, he offered him outside for a straightener, as we call it in Dublin. So, and of course, Eamon Dunphy, if you see the two of them together, he didn't fancy that because I think we know what would have happened there. So he's already made a hell of an entrance. I mean, he's come in, he's basically said that George Best had absolutely no credibility whatsoever. He's argued with the premier football writer at the time in the country, Peter Byrne, and he's offered Eamon Dunphy out for a straightener at the side.
Yeah, that's just typical Jack that we know and love now, isn't it? And it was just going to be a lot of fun going ahead with it, with the appointment, because you just wasn't going to suffer fools. And, the first one he probably took on really in the press was Dunphy then, and he had it marked out, didn't he? And that was a kind of relationship that was, evolve over time. Be very love-hate at times as well. Probably Jack hated him, I'd say, more so. But it was just, it's a crazy time. And it just shows you as well that, there was still leaks in the association that, Peter Byrne knew to ask that question. And I think it probably was quite unfair at the unveiling of a manager's job press conference, where you should be kind of all positive and talking about the future and what he's actually going to bring to Irish football. And yet you're talking about how close it was that he, the sliding doors moment, basically, that really you shouldn't be here, Jack, was kind of what they were alluding to. So fascinating to see that and see it in the TV footage there as well.
Rumour had it that Liam Toohey was actually going to take over as the right-hand man of Jack. I mean, who better? He knew the landscape of Irish football. He knew everybody. He was well-connected, well-respected as well, and would have made any transition for Jack much smoother. However, that didn't happen. And that's actually going to be a future episode, Martin.
Yeah, that's why it's just fascinating to cover. And I think people should be reassured that some of the uncertainty and the nonsense that goes on in the FAI has always been there in a sense. And hopefully this episode, where it covers this crazy voting procedure and who's even press leaks, who's kind of leading the kind of council and making these decisions, has always been there in the FAI. So we should be reassured we do get through the tough days. And, incredibly, Jack getting the job was a sliding doors moment, because it could have been Paisley. But thankfully, we can look back, 20, 30 years on and think of the amazing times we had under Jack and, qualifying for tournaments, which we'll come on to cover.
Exactly. And anybody listening to this probably screaming, go, why didn't you pick Bob? Well, to be fair, Bob was 65 at the time, and he actually wasn't very well. And I think people believed at the time he was showing signs of early signs of Alzheimer's, because he was actually director of Liverpool at the time. and he was Kenny Dalglish had taken over from Joe Fagan, who had resigned after the European Cup final 85 in Heysel, the disaster. Basically, he was guiding him, but he was actually guiding him and criticizing him simultaneously, criticizing him in the press. And Kenny had written about this actually in his book. I'm sure you read it, Martin. Basically saying that they felt that he was quite unwell because he didn't quite understand why he was doing this. We're not going to go any further. This is just about the appointment of Jack. We'll get to all the other stuff, I'm sure. I'm very excited about this series, Martin, going forward. I really am. And I can't wait to dig into some of the stories. So, Martin, thank you for coming on. Thank you at home for listening. And thank you for continuing to support the Green Machine podcast. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our Facebook page. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, our Instagram, and Twitter. And if you want, pop over to thegreenmachinepodcast.com and have a look, see what we've got going on over there. Thank you very much. Good night. God bless.
Put 'em under pressure. Put 'em under pressure.